Okay, everyone. Today on the Out of Spec podcast, I am joined by Kyle, and we're talking about a ban, I guess, is how Kyle put it. But basically, a trick that Kyle has been implementing to try to get better charging speeds when charging a Tesla product on the Tesla Supercharger network. But it seems like they might be on to you, Kyle, and they're making it clear. So we're going to dive into the details of the wet rag trick and basically what Tesla has said about not being able to do it anymore, if it's even useful, and all of that. This episode is made possible by the support we get from Fort Collins Kia. If you are in the market for any electric Kia, not only do they never add market adjustments, they will deliver your car to you anywhere in the 48 contiguous states for out-of-spec viewers. More information in the link in the show notes. Okay, Kyle, let's start with why are you putting wet rags on Tesla superchargers when you're charging at a supercharger station? What's going on?
Well, we've been doing this, and I'm not the one who came up with it, but many people have been doing this for over 7 or 8 years at Superchargers. So let's just say it took them 7 or 8 years to respond to doing the wet rag trick. And what is the wet rag trick? Well, it started back in the version 2 Supercharger days, where we would charge, back then they were only Tesla vehicles on Superchargers, and we would notice a D-rate after the cable got hot. And what we learned from some Tesla employees at the time was that actually the D rate initially was due to the exterior temperature sensor of the supercharger handle. And it was basically an issue where people were burning their hands on charging handle connectors, or they were too hot for comfort. And Tesla would say, okay, well, we have a sensor that's placed, on the exterior plastic component of the supercharger handle, and we will slow down charging speeds, i.e. reducing heat loss, i.e. reducing the temperature rise of the external plastic when charging would reach a certain level, not only in temperature, and then when it reaches a certain temperature level, but the way to reduce or hold that maximum temperature is to just reduce charging speeds, reduce the current. And that is what they were doing. So to get around that, we would put a rag initially just for shade, and then we were like, but we could actually make the rag wet and cool down that sensor, and we would retain fast charging speeds. And if you're in a rush, that really could help. It could save 10 minutes or more on a charging session. Or what we would have to do is unplug, move the car, and plug into another one. And so it really worked great. The thing is, we knew this is really not in the spirit of how to use charging equipment. So I really hope, and maybe in the very early days, we didn't really know what the heck we were doing. But at least recently now, we've never recommended anyone to do this. It was just a way to really try and get the maximum speeds into the vehicle. And we thought the problems were going to completely go away when version 3 supercharging came out, and they pretty much did initially. And the reason I say that is version 3 superchargers use a liquid cooled cable, but most importantly, liquid cooled connector. So the source of most of the heat is coming from where the DC pins interface, and you have a lot of resistance and it creates heat, and then it backs its way back. Of course, the cables will also get warm. There's an equation called I squared R, which shows more current, more heat loss on an exponential basis. And now Teslas are charging with even more current, and really hot weather outside has been this summer, especially with Cybertruck wanting over 700 amps for a significant period of time. It was almost impossible to get a good charging session with Cybertruck, even in cool temperatures, without using the wet rag trick. But that was up until about 8 weeks ago, where Tesla had, we felt, introduced some logic, I think rightly so, to try and stop the wet rag situation from cooling down the temperature sensor and increasing charging speeds. So there's a lot more to get into, but that is the history of the wet rag trick. It started 7+ years ago on version 2 superchargers, and it's now back again because Tesla doesn't know how to make, or at least is unwilling to install, a connector on their charging equipment that could handle consistent high current speeds.
So my first thought is like, is there any downside as the user of using the wet rag? It seems like you want to get faster charging speeds. The really only downside that of it getting hot is that you can't touch it as a user. But is there any other downside to the wet rag besides having to use a wet rag?
I mean, yes, in theory, it's fooling a temperature sensor into charging faster, which is not in the spirit of why sensors are there. And
Yeah.
from a safety perspective, yeah, not great. A lot of people were like concerned, by the way. They're like, oh, you're putting a wet rag on the cable that has 800 volts in it. Well, it's like it rains outside. You're touching that cable in the rain. That was not the issue. But what really is the issue from Tesla's perspective, and I've always felt they may have had this opinion, but this is the first time they've ever said anything about it in all these years, is that you are fooling the sensor, and that basically doesn't help them with their diagnostics. So
Yes.
go
They
ahead.
actually tweeted about this today or yesterday, July 24th, to an old tweet from Inside EVs from May about, Inside EV said, yes, you can put a wet towel on a supercharger hander to get faster charging speeds. And then yesterday, July 24th, Tesla Charging tweeted and they said, placing a wet cloth on supercharger cable handles does not increase charging rates and interferes with temperature monitors, creating a risk of overheating or damage. Please refrain from doing this so our systems can run correctly and true charging issues can be detected by our systems. What do you think?
Well, first of all, it does make it charge faster, or at least it did. And I'll talk about what they did a few weeks ago. And we've proven many times that not even just using a wet rag, but pouring water on the connection, just like it was raining outside, would dramatically increase charging speeds. And it happens even more so, not just with Tesla vehicles, but with non-Tesla vehicles using the supercharger network. So Rivians, for example, pull 500 amps for a long time. And we've shown many, many times with Rivian now, we've let it derate, go way down to the point where it's charging at a snail's pace. We then just take a water bottle, pour it on the connector, which I don't know how they're going to stop that because it rains outside. And then the charging speeds go right back up. I mean, there's proof of it right there. So that was everything up until about 8 weeks ago. About 8 weeks ago, or maybe even sooner, we started to notice that the wet rag stopped working. In the sense where even just the other day, I had your VinFast with Jordan charging, and the VinFast doesn't pull much power, but it was enough to overheat the supercharger handle using a Magic Dock. And any
Wow.
car, really. I mean, the thermals on the Tesla superchargers are so terrible in the summertime, really terrible. And so your car was down to, I want to say, 70 kilowatts or something when it should have been doing 140. So it was getting half the charging speed because the connector was warm. And we put a damp cloth on the connector or on the Tesla supercharger handle, and we noticed instantly it went like 70, 84, 85, 86, and then it just held there. And then we're like, oh, Tesla must have logic to realize there's no feasible possible way that the temperature sensor in the handle would cool off that quickly. And therefore, we're just going to cap the amperage here for the session. And it never recovered. Even when we removed the handle, it actually got hot again and derated. And so it seems like they've detected that. On the flip side, that same day, actually, I was doing a charging test on Brandon's Model 3 Performance. So I started the supercharging session with the wet rag to try and never let it get hot so it didn't have the opportunity to even derate. And it actually didn't even give us max amperage. It capped at about 600 amps. And then kind of just held there, and it didn't even unlock to 250 kilowatts, and the car could take it. So
So they're watching.
it seems to me that there's new logic based off of temperature sensors to basically make the wet rag now not work. And that corroborates, is that the right word? That shows that what they just said in their statement, that the wet rag does not increase charging speeds, it shows that that's true. And so, maybe some more experimenting is needed on my side, but really at the end of the day, if there's no benefit to using the wet rag, we'll find some other way to make the cars charge faster that's within the terms of service, that's allowable. And part of those can be tricks like finding a supercharger where the handle is in the shade and not baking in the sun. And there's other little tricks and tips that we've found over the years that can help with this thermal issue. Also, version 4 dispensers should help a lot. What I want to do, though, quickly is just mention that with the wet rag, you're really actually could cause an issue. This is why we've always recommended our audience not to do it. And the reason is you're cooling the exterior temperature sensor of the handle. That is not the heat generation source. The heat generation source is, again, deeper in the handle where it's inside the mating surface is inside the vehicle's inlet port. Really, the cooling benefits of the wet rag are not cooling the actual heat source. It's just tricking a sensor to charge faster. Now, thankfully, at least Tesla vehicles monitor AC and DC pin temperatures. They share the same pins, and you can watch them get up to about 65 degrees Celsius, and that's about where they start to derate. So there's still some temperature monitoring safety there. But where it maybe becomes even more of a problem is, yes, it's good to have double redundancy, temperature monitoring in the handle as well as in the vehicle. I believe the Supercharger handles also have temperature sensors at the mating surface. So there's multiple sensors inside the connector, but it's never good to, you want all of them to be, functional. And so I totally get Tesla's point here. And then on the vehicle side, Teslas at least are monitored, but Superchargers are open to non-Teslas now. And the adapters do not dynamically derate. They're not powered adapters. So they have temperature safety cutoff switches where they will interrupt charging, interrupt the communication, but they cannot say, hey, I'm getting hot, slow down. Hey, I'm getting hot, slow down. The vehicle can do that on the inlet port side, but the adapter has to rely on the charger or the vehicle inlet port to derate. They cannot dynamically derate. There's no adapter on the market today that can, because they're all passive. And so I think in spirit, I've always believed don't tamper with charging. We've always urged our audience not to do this. However, it did work. It worked really well. And it actually benefited Tesla, benefited us driving Teslas many times when we were in cross-country races and things like that. So now the only way around it is to plug in until it tapers, unplug, move the truck, plug in again until it tapers, unplug, move the truck, plug in. And it's just, you're going to see a lot of people doing the old Supercharger shuffle again, which is what we all used to have to do or had to do in the version 2 days to get the best charging speed. So yeah, I think they're totally correct. I'm surprised it took them this long to say anything. I'm glad they've come up with logic to detect this because, again, you don't want any safety issues out there. And we've always thought, okay, my viewpoint was, okay, the vehicle is monitoring the inlet port, okay, just for this one session or this few times that we need to do it for a race or something like that. Yeah, it's great. I don't think there's any way for them to get around you pouring water on the connector. I mean, I still think the logic that they have on there is, it might actually stop it from unlocking now because they're looking for that temperature dip, outside of realistic temperature decrease. And they'll basically hold the current at its, restricted level. But yeah, I'm glad there's some official communication, and I'm glad they're going to put a stop to it. I really think they should come up with a connector that doesn't overheat.
Yeah, that seems to be the main point here is, you still want the best charging experience possible. So, but that would be retrofitting a ton of their stations, which I'm not sure that they're interested in doing. Have you noticed this on any other networks so dramatically? I mean, from my charging on CCS networks, it's never been like too hot to the touch that unless it's just sitting in the sun like all day in a heat wave.
No, Superchargers seem to be the most temperature sensitive of the bunch, but it is not uncommon to have CCS derates due to cable and connector
Yes.
temperature. Especially a lot of cables are air cooled and they have a boost profile. And so you may have like a 300 amp nominal cable that boosts to 500 amps for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And that fits within the realm of most vehicles' time of which they'd be pulling over 300 amps, because most charging curves are big peaks and then they die down. But as more fat charging curve EVs come on the market, we are going to have cable temperature limitations on CCS as well, without, without really having a liquid cooled or immersion cooled cable all the way to the copper pins with a cooled inlet port on the vehicle side. Everything needs to be temperature monitored. Everything needs to derate when things get hot. Everyone has a different idea of what is hot and what is too hot to be safe. But at the end of the day, those safety measures need to be in there. And, we should not be fooling them. So, I just want to say that was it was an interesting experiment that we did for the last 7 years, but you won't really catch us doing it anymore. I mean, occasionally I'm sure we'll try to see how their logic is doing, but we're certainly have never and will never recommend our audience to do the wet rag trick. But also, I think it's kind of funny. Tesla never reached out to us about it. Obviously, the entire charging team knew we were doing this. So it's why don't they just say don't do it? And all they did was reply to a tweet from a while ago.
Yeah. Instead of being yeah, it did work before, but it's not going to work now. It's no, that doesn't work at all. That technique is it's a fool's errand, but it did work. The fact is that they're seem to be working actively to make sure that they can detect this kind of dramatic change in temperature so that they're following, I don't know, whatever charging behavior that they want their chargers to do.
My wish is that, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just classic Tesla communication, I think.
Yeah, of course. But my wish is that Tesla will develop a version 3 connector retrofit that is similar to version 4 cables, where they're immersion cooled all the way to the pins up front. And I don't think it's that big of a task to retrofit all of them. They do them every few thousand cycles, I think. So give it a couple years of usage and everything would be retrofitted out anyway. And I think that would really help reduce a pain point of supercharging, especially as they're opening up the network to other vehicles.
Yeah.
And the Rivians are one of the hardest vehicles on charging infrastructure because they just sit at 500 amps for a while. And then, I just hope they get their cables together, their what together. And you certainly nice. Glad they said something after 7 years. That's awesome. So many people have been tagging me, by the way. It was so funny how, it's, I guess, it's common knowledge that Out of Spec does this, which we do. And I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of the replies to this tweet are oh, snap, Kyle ain't gonna like this, and stuff like that. And of course, like Kyle says, it's not recommended, but, people might. You are researching, you're experimenting, and
there's no
racing sometimes.
we this is our warning. We shouldn't do it anymore. And from Tesla's standpoint, you are tampering with temperature sensors, and whether they're there because you want to not have the your hand get burned, or if it's actually to protect the contact mating surface of the connectors that are handling the high current, high voltage charging. Okay. That's up for debate. But at the end of the day, it's their equipment, their property that we're lucky enough to use. And it worked. I don't like how they said it didn't work, because it worked and we proved it so many times. But you won't catch us doing it anymore.
Yeah, we won't do it anymore. We'll see how the influx of different EVs onto the network mixes things up too. But right now it's just Ford and Rivian. But one day it'll be many, many of them.
I'll tell you what, this summer has proved how hard it is to charge an electric car in the warmth. And by the way, so many people, when I complain about how EVs suck charging in hot weather, not necessarily because of the cars, but the charging infrastructure, both have issues in many cases. People are like, well, it's just a heat wave. But I'm like, this is planet Earth. Design your shit to work on our planet. It's not hard. We know the operational temperature and sunlight conditions that exist on our planet. And even in mildly warm conditions, things are having issues. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, on the road trips that I've taken lately, and usually at Electrify America stations, but really any of them, they've been in heat waves, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm standing on an asphalt parking lot trying to restart a charge at this charging station, just absolutely baking. All I want is a canopy. It would be cool if it had solar, but it doesn't have to. But I think people just spending any time at these, that could, one, add some shade, and two, you wouldn't have to cook your customers on the parking lot asphalt.
We could do a canopy podcast on some of the challenges on installing them because it's expensive and increases the permitting time. And we should definitely do that. Add that to the list. Let's do a canopy episode.
Love a good canopy. All right, folks. So sorry about it. It looks like you can't use your wet rag. It did work before, but it looks like they're going to make it pretty hard for it to work in the future. Of course, leave it to Kyle to figure out other ways that we might be able to speed up those charging speeds and manage the heat, but we'll have to see. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Spec podcast. Thanks, Kyle, for coming along, calling in from the Cybertruck nonetheless. And drive safe, everyone. Stay charged. We'll see you next time. Bye.